Hello YouTube. I want to introduce today information about events that took place in the Antarctic in 1945. This information is virtually unknown in the West, except for certain agencies, of course, and comes from open Russian sources. Of course, I do not know what is hidden away in the Soviet and now Russian military and other related governmental archives, but I am sure that if we had a chance to look at them, we would be more than fascinated. As for my other research about Soviet and Russian secrets of the Antarctic or Antarctica, please see the playlist in my video channel. The playlist is titled Mysteries of Russian Antarctica. The collapse of the Third Reich was marked by the suicide of Adolf Hitler on April 30th, 1945 in Berlin. However, a number of researchers, both in the post-war years and today, doubt that the head of the Nazi Germany indeed took his own life. There was a lot of speculation as to where Hitler might have escaped to from occupied Berlin. Most often as a possible secret refuge of the Nazi leader, reference was made to a secret base of the Germans in Antarctica. This base began to be constructed before World War II. Since the testimony of witnesses, as well as the examination of charred corpses, did not allow to claim with 100% guarantee that the remains they found belonged to Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, the Commissar of State Security of the USSR, Merkulov, flew to Germany in 1945. According to the data and information collected by his staff, it was established that 10 days before the alleged suicide, Unter den Linden Street, located near Hitler's bunker, had been cleared for the takeoff of aircraft, and from April 20th, main staff of the bunker did not see Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun in normal daylight or illumination. Semi-darkness reigned in the underground shelter of the head of the Third Reich, so it was not difficult to replace the real dictator with one of his doubles. And Hitler's fanatical entourage during the interrogations could simply lie that their leader was in the bunker until April 30th and then committed suicide. Of course, neither then nor today no one would deny that the official version of Hitler's suicide was, but it was necessary to check the possible places of his escape. Moreover, in the building of the General Staff of the German Navy, Soviet intelligence officers found maps showing the passage of a special convoy of Adolf Hitler, consisting of submarines, underwater caves under the land of Queen Maud in Antarctica. The ultimate goal of the journey was to the reverse side of the Earth, so to say. The maps even marked the continents of this mysterious country. Between October 25th and November 10, 1945, 3 submarines were scheduled to be sent to the shores of Antarctica for a reconnaissance convoy. In addition to the crew, 3 officers of the KGB were to be present on board of the ships. The expedition was led by the Admiral of the Soviet Navy, Kuznetsov. The Admiral was ordered by a special order of July 12, 1945, to establish the truth of the existence of the so-called Base 211. And it happened after the People's Commissar, or Minister, of the KGB of the USSR, Merkulov, received an unusual report on June 28, 1945. And here's what it said. I report that on June 12, 1945, the counterintelligence officers of Smersh of the 9th Rifle Corps discovered in the German Navy headquarters building at Berlin Tiergarten Tirpitzufer 38-42 maps of the passage in the sea depths, with signature stamp only for the captains of submarines A-class Sonderkonvoiführer. There were 38 pieces under the number with the series 44, number 0188 to 1099, 0228 to 0239, and number 0555, 0870, and 1489. According to the translation of the text to the instructions on the map, the subject is the passage of underwater corridors to enter the Agarthu under the ice of Antarctica. On each of the maps in the timetables, graphs, numbers, and signs requiring deciphering by experts in the field of astronomy and navigation, and different clues are marked. Probably the clues were used depending on the time of year and location of the moon. The maps were printed in the quantity of 1,500 copies at the Dachau concentration camp, 17 kilometers from Munich, in the Zonder laboratory in January of 1944. This indicated the extreme confidentiality of the information on the maps and that all persons involved in their manufacture were destroyed. Appendix, maps, translation on 38 sheets. It is time to let you know what SMERSH was. It was an umbrella organization for 3 independent counterintelligence agencies in the Red or later Soviet Army, formed in late 1942 or even earlier, but officially announced only on April 14, 1943. The name SMERSH was coined by Joseph Stalin. It means Смерть шпионам, or death to spies, and SMERSH was directly responsible to only Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. Soviet intelligence officers could not simply believe in the authenticity of these maps, as well as the theory of the Hollow Land, gleaned by Germans in the Tibetan manuscripts. However, since the construction of the Nazi base in Antarctica was known for certain, the reliability of these maps had to be verified. At the same time, the Soviet secret services planned to confirm or deny Hitler's presence in Antarctica. Oil was added to the fire by the testimony of Lieutenant Captain Werner Braun, who was detained by SMERSH on September 22, 1945. He was the aide to the commander of the 21st Submarine Flotilla, which was part of the convoy of the Nazi leader. The man confirmed the presence of a secret German base in Antarctica. A month later, on October 18, 1945, Admiral Nikolai Gerasimov, the People's Commissar of the Soviet Navy, agreed to send 3 Katyusha submarines, K-56, K-51, and K-53 to the shores of the 6th continent. There was another curious document obtained by the same Merkulov on September 12, 1945, when Kuznetsov was already preparing for an exploration expedition to discover this Nazi refuge hidden in the ice of Antarctica. Someone named Abakumov wrote to the Minister of the Soviet State Security, "I am sending a secret notebook with the text of the summarized orders of the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of Germany, Adolf Hitler, and the Reichsfuhrer on the selection of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Navy and the troops as candidates for sending to Antarctica. The notebook with the orders belongs to Colonel Wilhelm Wolff of the Wehrmacht, whom the SMERSH counterintelligence are currently searching for." The notebook was found among the archival documents of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht in the town Pirna near Dresden. Maps, which were in the possession of the Soviet Special Services, still had to be read, and it became possible, as we already know, when the SMERSH operative captured on September 22, 1945, Lieutenant Captain Werner Braun. During the preliminary interrogation, he stated that he had information about the operations of the German Navy submarine fleet in Antarctica. He was sent to Moscow, and with his assistance, the Soviet military leadership began to hastily prepare an operation to infiltrate and get into the dungeons of Antarctica. On October 18, Admiral Nikolai Gerasimovich Kuznetsov, the People Commissar of the Soviet Navy, wrote to Merkulov that he was ready to send 3 cruise submarines to Antarctica. I already mentioned them: K-55, K-53, and K-56. This was the nickname given to that class of submarines in the Soviet Union. The Red Army installed the latest modification of torpedoes and deep bombs, mounted the most modern navigation equipment, and selected for the cruise the most experienced and physically fit sailors for these submarines, nicknamed Katyushas. The nature of the expedition to be carried out was not disseminated. More or less only a narrow circle of command staff and the KGB officers accompanying the expeditions were fully informed about the campaign. Again, 3 Katyusha submarine cruisers were equipped with torpedoes, powerful depth bombs, and the most modern navigation equipment at the time. After making a long sea crossing, the Soviet submarines approached the Queen Maud land in November of 1945. However, summons was already waiting for them off the coast of Antarctica. The main part of Katyusha's journeys was performed in a surface position. When they reached the designated point, 68 degrees south latitude and 1 degree east longitude, the submarine cruiser K-56 dived, went under the waters. At a depth of 100 meters, its hydroacoustic instruments recorded the movement around the submarine of about 10 unusual underwater targets, which would nowadays be described as USOs, or you can call them unidentified underwater objects or unidentified submersible objects. They constantly maneuvered and at the same time moved at a speed of about 66 knots, which was 3 times the maximum speed of Katyusha in the surface position. It was several times higher than the technical capabilities of both Soviet and German submarines in those years. Underwater, the speed of the Soviet cruising submarine did not even exceed 10 knots. The risky maneuvering or tactics of the underwater object of unknown origins was extremely dangerous, constantly threatening to collide with Soviet submarines. In this situation, it was decided not to tempt fate and without endangering the lives of the crews of Soviet submarines to return back, as Merkulov reported to the leadership of the USSR. As Comrade Merkulov later reported to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Soviet submariners encountered this phenomenon for the first time. It was probably about unknown underwater equipment of the German Navy, he surmised. What else could Merkulov conclude? It was not possible to attack USOs with torpedoes because of their speed and frequent abrupt change of course. The Soviets had to leave. The entrance to the New Berlin and presumably Hitler, who was there, were guarded very securely, but it was not clear who actually guarded the entrance. Is the mystery of the German base in Antarctica still unsolved? Of course not, according to some Russian researchers. A few years ago, in a conversation with a high-ranking military officer who was trained at the prestigious Frunze Academy, one of the researchers mentioned the failed campaign of Soviet submarines to the shores of Antarctica to find a German secret base. Hearing about this, the interlocutor said that he had personally read materials from the library of the Academy, which said that this expedition was repeated after a decade and a half. According to him, Soviet submariners did discover a German base with a lot of jewelry and art items exported or stolen from Europe. However, the base was abandoned for a long time and its infrastructure did not function. It did not function. Of course, there was no mention of Hitler being in it. inside this way, let alone the passages to the inside of the earth. Here I want to add a few remarks based on my years of research. It is becoming clear that the Soviet counterintelligence discovered something very valuable in the capital of crushed Nazi Germany. And it happened in November-December of 1945. It took time for the Soviets to analyze the documents obtained, if they did analyze all of them. And I described the situation in my books co-authored with Philip Mantle. The information pertained to what we could call paranormal phenomena. But the USOs encountered by the Soviet submariners in 1945 in Antarctica were not made in Germany, and for all the talk of the secret Nazi bases or super weapons, their totalitarian empire was crushed and defeated, and no secret weapons saved them, and no secret bases saved the behinds of the Nazi evil rulers. Now, a few more words about 1945. We already know that in November of 1945, a detachment of Soviet submarines embarked on to the shores of the Queen Maud Land. After they returned to the USSR, all the crew members and people who organized the campaign signed for non-disclosure of state secrets for the rest of their lives. Soviet special services had to examine the results of the Antarctic activities of the Germans, but not in the inner cavity of the earth. Now they had to do it on the surface, in the hope of finding an answer to the questions about Nazi activities in the so-called inner earth. Well, what followed was a special operation by the GRU, military intelligence of the General Staff, and counterintelligence SMERSH, during which crowded German colonies were discovered on a number of islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. Merkulov was very much hoping for help in solving the Antarctic secrets from the British and the Americans, but they, according to the Russians, at least some Russians, were silent. They apparently preferred to solve the Nazi mysteries of the icy continent entirely on their own. Indeed, in January 1947, an American expedition supported by a large naval force under the command of Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd Jr. headed to the Queen Maud Land. However, this is outside of the scope of my research, except for a few conclusions I'll mention later. Well, as for Merkulov, this Soviet statesman, politician, and army general, well, he was arrested in the case of Lavrenti Beria on charges of treason in the form of espionage and conspiracy to seize power, etc. This took place after Stalin died, and struggle for power took place in the Soviet Union and in the Kremlin, of course. So on December 23, 1953, Merkulov was sentenced by the Military College of the Supreme Court of the USSR under Article 58 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation to the death penalty. The death penalty, and on the same day he was shot at 21 hours 20 minutes. The body was cremated in the furnace of the first Moscow crematorium, and the ashes were buried in the common grave of the Don Cemetery. As for Katyushas, well, the K-56 sank during nuclear tests on October 10, 1957. And for those who are interested, Queen Maud Land, region of Antarctica extending from Coats Land west and Enderby Land east, and including the Princess Martha, Princess Astrid, Princess Ragnhild, Princess Harald, and Prince Olaf coasts. It's a barren plateau covered by an ice sheet up to 1.5 miles thick. It has a mountainous coastal area with rocky peaks exceeding 11,800 feet above sea level. They pierce the ice cap. The region was discovered by a Norwegian expedition in 1930, claimed by Norway in 1939, and declared a dependency of that nation in 1949. It was named for the Norwegian queen. Several countries have operated coastal research stations there. For example, the Soviet Union and later Russia has maintained continual operations, although they were moved from Lazarev Station to Novolazarevskaya Station. Lazarev, an Antarctic scientific station of the USSR, operated from March 10, 1959 to February 26, 1961 on the Lazarev ice shelf. 1961. You know, let's remember this period. As for the year 1960, when the second Soviet submarine expedition to the Queen Mud Land allegedly took place, that's the year when it took place. In the books co-authored with Philip Mantle, a renowned British UFO researcher, we mentioned the 1960 incident that transpired in Argentina. In January 1960, two huge unusual submarines were discovered at the depths of the ocean by Argentinian Navy. One submarine was lying on the ground. The other was circling around it. In response to official inquiries from Buenos Aires, both Washington and Moscow responded that there were no submarines near the Argentine coast that belonged to them. Allegedly, the United States urgently sent the aircraft carrier Independence to help the Argentinians. In 10 days, tons of deep bombs were dropped on the intruders of the Argentine borders. However, they achieved only one thing. Submarines of this unprecedented form with huge globular deck cabin surfaced and with incredible speed began to leave or departed. Artillery fire was open. The submarines immediately descended into the ocean depths. What the sailors saw on the screens of sonar stunned them. The number of submarines first doubled, then there were 6 of them. The chase did not do anything. Mysterious flotilla, having developed incredible speed, disappeared in the depths of the Atlantic. Nikita Khrushchev sent a secret request to the Soviet attaché in Argentina. We need details of this incident. I wonder if the USOs from Antarctica changed their areas of operations in the 15 years since the failed Soviet expedition to the Antarctica regions. Now let's look at some other developments of the time pertaining to the Antarctic. I want you to know what is being promoted by some in Russia. Not all, some. In all Soviet encyclopedias and reference books, it is written that the capitalist countries began to divide Antarctica long before the Second World War. How successful they were, we can judge at least by the fact that the Soviet government, concerned about the progress of the British and Norwegians in exploring the southern latitude, in January 1939 made a formal protest to the governments of these countries in connection with the fact that their Antarctic expeditions were engaged in unreasonable division into the sectors of land once discovered by Russian researchers and navigators. When the British and Norwegians, soon bogged down in the battles of the Second World War, were not very concerned about Antarctica, such notes were sent to neutral at the time, but no less aggressive in Stalin's opinion, United States and Japan. A new turn of the destructive war, which soon engulfed half of the world, for a time stopped all these disputes, but only for a while. A year and a half after the end of hostilities in the Pacific, the Soviet military had the most detailed aerial photographs of the entire coast of the Queen Maud Land. Those who really know still claim that the Soviets simply took away the data and information after World War II from the Germans, who, as we know, carried out 2 large-scale Antarctic expeditions a year before the Polish military campaign of 1939. And for those who do not know, Poland was invaded by Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, the two countries being allies at the time. This was before Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. So the Soviets did not deny that that's how they obtained this information about Antarctica, but refused, according to some Russian researchers, to share their trophy with other interested parties, citing national interests. According to such Russian researchers, after the hasty departure of the Admiral Byrd expedition from Antarctica, America urgently began informal negotiations with the governments of Argentina, Chile, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, and France. At the same time, a cautious but persistent campaign in the press or media began in the United States itself. In one of the Central American magazines, Foreign Affairs, a former U.S. envoy to the Soviet Union, George Kennan, who had recently left Moscow for consultations with his government, he published an article in which he made it very clear that they need to organize a speedy response to the disproportionately grown ambitions of the Soviets, which, after the successful end of the war with Germany and Japan, are in a hurry to take advantage of their military and political victories, but in distant Antarctica. In response to this statement, as if to be the official policy of the White House, that's how they claimed it, Stalin issued his own memorandum on the political regime of Antarctica, where in a rather sharp form he recalled that the intentions of the ruling elite of the United States was to deprive the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics of its legal right based on discoveries in this part of the world by Russian navigators made in the early 19th century. At the same time, some other measures were taken to symbolize Soviet protest against the American policy towards Antarctica. Here's what modern Russian researchers believe. Possibly as a result of these measures, the Secretary of State James Burns, who promoted the most harsh sanctions against the USSR, suddenly resigned, clearly forced to do so by President of the United States, and Burns' last words in public office were, according to the Russian researchers, "The damn Russians have been impossible to frighten. In this matter," meaning Antarctica, "they won." When it came to Antarctica, the USSR was supported by Argentina and France. Truman, reflecting on the balance of power created in the region, reluctantly expressed his consent to the participation of Stalin's representatives at the International Conference on Antarctica, which was scheduled to be held in Washington, but stressed that if the Treaty on the Equal Presence of all the countries concerned is signed, it must certainly include such an important items as the demilitarization of Antarctica and the prohibition of any military activity on its territory, including nuclear, and the development of raw materials needed to create weapons should be banned too. The treaty, which had a valid force for the demilitarization of the continent, was signed only in 1959. Until that time, everyone did whatever they wanted around the South Pole. Well, in its claims to its own piece of the coast of Antarctica, the USSR was not alone. Stalin, unexpectedly for the United States, was fully supported by France and Argentina. Well, let's look at France. Despite the country's membership in the so-called capitalist camp, at the time its government was run by the communists, led by Maurice Thorez. And even when later the rights of the communists were significantly curtailed, France's relations with the Soviets still remained. If not friendly, then in any case trustworthy. In order to realize this fact, it is enough to note that when in 1966, even 2 years after the death of Thérèse, the permanent member of parliament, when France withdrew from NATO, Lyndon Johnson, in a private conversation with his special assistant for national security, Bondi, stated the following literally, according to these Russians: despite all the disadvantages, there is still one fine point in this story. Now our military secrets, which was shared with this Frenchman, will cease to get directly to the Russians. Another interesting detail: in the immediate vicinity of the Queen Maud Land in Antarctica is a group of French-owned islands: Kerguelen, Cross, and St. Paul. All the islands are uninhabited, and on the latter, among other things, there are very convenient bays with calm waters, the best fit for parking ocean ships. After the war, both the Americans and the British repeatedly appealed to de Gaulle to provide them with these islands to establish their military bases, but the communists, firmly established in the French Provisional Government and then in the government of the newly formed Fourth Republic, for them it was unacceptable, and these proposals were rejected outright. Officially, it is not known whether Joseph Stalin made such proposals for his part, but the Soviet ships until his death in 1953 were very often seen in various bases of the French Navy around the world, and especially in Haiphong, New Caledonia, and the Caribbean. With Argentina, Stalin's affairs were not worse. They were, I think, a little bit better. Argentina pursued fairly independent policy in relation to the United States. Contrary to Truman's warnings, the newly elected president of Argentina, Juan Perón, with great fanfare and without any regard to Washington, sent his very best diplomats and ambassadors to Moscow, restoring diplomatic relations that had been broken off from the USSR previously. Immediately after this act, as if everything had been agreed to in advance, millions of tons of Argentinian wheat, cotton, and imported strategic raw materials in the form of tungsten and beryllium ores, so necessary for Stalin, they all poured into the Soviet Union. General Perón successfully applied divide and conquer rule or policy, being what the Russians consider a purely capitalist power. The Argentinians took advantage of the main contradictions between the USA and the USSR, and good relations with Stalin for them at that moment were much more important than the favor of the Americans. In exchange for providing the Soviet Navy ships with some of their sub-Antarctic bases, they in particular received unspoken guarantees from the Soviet government that they, the Soviets, would not prosecute many Nazi generals hiding in the Argentinian territory, who, according to current, most approximate, and clearly underestimated estimates, invested more than $30 billion after the war in the Argentinian economy from the funds stolen in Europe by the same Hitlerites who settled in Argentina. And the struggle for the control of Antarctica was carried on. The same researchers claim that a secretive Soviet Antarctica flotilla actually engaged in fighting Admiral Byrd his high jump expedition, that the Americans suffered defeat and fled. This, of course, is a wishful thinking on their part. I have collected Russian military analysis of such nonsensical claims, sober evaluation of the pseudo-historical hypothesis. If such claims persist, I will present the evidence, again, which was analyzed by Russian military people. What I believe happened in early 1946 was exchange of information between the Soviets and the Americans, and further cooperation against a common adversary. The Soviets were present in Antarctica since about the same time, and I do not believe that the United States was concerned too much about their warm relations with the Argentines or the French. So in reality, the Cold War rhetoric aside, both world powers and the former allies joined forces against an advanced intelligent life form present on our planet. It is not clear what the Nazis actually discovered, if anything. Meanwhile, the Cold War pretext allowed USA and USSR to expand their military know-how and build powerful new weapons. This relationship, a very guarded and concealed to the extent possible, still continues today, with Russia as successor to the USSR. And we still do not know what USOs caused Soviet submarines to abort the mission in 1945 and return home. But hopefully one day we will know about 1945 and about 1960. And please see my other videos. It will add to the information that I already presented here, and also later developments in Argentina and in Antarctica, and it will show you what the Soviet submarines had observed not that long ago over the South Pole. I ask you, if you like my research, to please support me. You will find the information in the description of this video, and stay tuned for more of my research. Thank you.